Good morning, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, a leading voice in the field of equity in Britain. Professor Danny Dorling is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Oxford, and his work compels us to examine the social and spatial inequalities that shape our world today. His research delves into really critical areas such as housing, health, employment, education, and poverty, and asks us questions about the interconnected nature of these challenges. We invite Professor Dorling to our stage this morning to discuss how these combine and hypothesize about the future, what this means for us in education, and what this may mean for us over the next decade. A very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much. Thanks for coming. I'm going to try and be quick. I'm going to talk for just over 25 minutes. I'm going to show you a load of pictures, and then I would like you to ask me questions because that's much more interesting for me. I'm a geographer. I've worked in Newcastle, Bristol, Leeds, Sheffield, now down in Oxford. I never left school, if you like. I've never done much of a proper job. I get to play with images and graphs and ideas and controversial ideas and things which are near the bone, which I guess a lot of you have to worry about, or what can you say? How do you react to people saying certain things? What can you say in front of children? Which I think is always interesting. What do you do when children ask certain things and you're supposed to be neutral? What can you say? This is a map of the world, data from about 15 years ago. It's the world stretched so that every child has an equal amount of space. So that's what the planet looks like from the point of view of children. Right? The continent of Africa is big, India is big, the centre of the world is in India, China's relatively large. You can even see the world's largest city there, which is kind of ballsy. It's Chongqing. It's possible to draw a map of the world on a screen of this size that stretches it, where you can actually see individual streets in places like Tokyo. Right? So different ways of thinking about the world. Inequalities, crises, and children. I write books. If I write enough books, they don't make me do other things, so I keep on writing books. All the graphs from all the books are on my website. You can take them, use them for whatever you want. I'm going to show you a few things from some books a couple of years ago and then get on to children and crises. This is a little graph showing the amount of carbon being emitted by people into the atmosphere every year and how it's risen. Maybe one of the things that young people are quite scared and concerned about. Many of you might be quite worried about this. I turn these things around to look at them in different kinds of detail. So this is the same data, the same graph, but now we're looking at when it actually goes up and when it actually falls back. That original graph it's not easy to see the detail. And the problem with this graph is it's leaning away from me. So it isn't just that the amount of carbon we're emitting is rising. On average, it's rising by more each year than the year before. This is not good news. The book that graph appears in is called Slowdown. And the reason it's called Slowdown is that almost everything we measure is slowing down, apart from things like carbon emissions, global temperature. The number of students at universities worldwide, that's still accelerating. It's going to have to slow down, because you can't all go to university, or you can't get past that. And the number of flights people take has been accelerating, but everything else has been slowing down. One, I think, slightly sad thing about that graph is that every time we have a global summit, like at Rio or Paris, we seem to think we've achieved something, and then it accelerates away. But it's got more to do with global economy, recessions, booms. Going to quickly go on to another. People often worry about people. We worry there are too many people coming, too many people on the planet, that kind of issue. Somehow, students coming to study geography got into their head a figure of about 5 billion being the kind of number that the planet should have. I've still never found out where that 5 billion number came from. Anyway, there's about 8 billion of us now. By the time I die, there may be 10.5 billion, and then there'll be less. This is the central projection of the United Nations at the moment. Peak human is forecast to about 2084. It's probably going to be the 2070s when it comes. Now, I haven't shown you the original version of this graph. The original version of the graph has human population from 2,000 years ago, very, very low, very low, very low, and it goes up like this, okay? What I'm doing is showing you the changes because this really, really interesting thing is happening. We are decelerating. The number of people is still going up, but the amount by which it rises every year is starting to fall. The only reason it's going up is because you and I are healthier than our parents. So we are less likely to die this year than they were. People are aging. The main reason for population rise in the world is us, older people. It's not babies. Peak baby was around about 1990. There was a little peak about 24 years after that when they had their kids. But it's not rising up. Going to show you the graph one more time, different way. And the kind of summary of world population, always going up. Even when things like the Black Death occurred, it only occurred to part of the planet and part of us and probably didn't result in an overall fall. There were 3 big events there. The first is shortly after 1492, when 3 little ships crossed the Atlantic carrying germs, possibly a coronavirus, apart from all the other things that we carried, and millions of people died in the Americas, right? Slowed down the growth. The second thing, it's quite interesting to be in the Armouries, be in Leeds. The second thing was when a few countries in Europe decided to invade almost the rest of the planet and destroy every stable social system. Leading those countries was the United Kingdom. At various points, we invaded and walked into 90% of the current members of the United Nations and claimed their lands. And at the same time, destroyed what was keeping stability in these places. And that resulted in a global population boom, the one we worry about now. If you ever want to worry about people and say, why are there so many people? Well, the answer, I'm afraid, is more to blame here with what we did than anybody else. But the current one isn't because of germs or invasion or disruption. The current slowdown is because women have secured enough power to be able to say no far more often than they ever could before. Contraception and other things make it easier, but it's actual choices over reproduction. And it's amazing. Everywhere, worldwide, we're seeing the number of children that people are having falling. In the poorest places, in the richest places. I wouldn't get worried about it. I search for where there's population rises. The only one I found so far is women who have long commutes, who have partners, male, who are working from home. There's a slight increase in the number of children, right? Because he can't get out of doing the housework if. Anyway, it's speculation. I do wonder. You can get to controversial. I do wonder at what point. You may know that the average age gap between men and women, most partnerships are men and women, average age gap is about 3 to 5 years. The men tend to be older. Now, what happens when that changes? Okay, if you're trying to work out at what point are we going to actually get back to having 2 children on average, which is the number you need to have. And I do wonder whether it'll be when women work out, actually, a younger person, younger man might be more used, particularly when you get old. Anyway, just controversial things. May never happen, but anyway. A lot of my books are moany because I started working on inequality in the 1980s and 1990s, and it just got worse. Okay, very good for my career, very bad for the place I happen to live. This book came out a year ago about Shattered Nation. The interesting thing is, for me, a lot of time, particularly during the Blair years and the New Labour years, it was quite hard arguing about things not being great and so on, and quite controversial. I don't meet anybody anymore who says it's all going well, right? But at least that part got easier. Another graph for you. Maybe, I think, the most important one for current British history. I say arrogantly, but this is a graph of inequality. It's what's happened to income inequality over a century. The top line is the average income of the best 1% of the 1%, right? The best of 1 in 10,000 people. The people who 100 years ago owned country mansions and had many servants. There's always a best of 1%, right? There's always a best of 1% of the 1%. But by the 1970s, the best off were taking the least they had ever taken in this country. We had an income inequality that was almost at the level of Sweden. Right? This, England, was basically a Nordic country. The number of things that we'd done are incredible. We had nationalised our health service. It was world leading. There were only 6 tiny countries where people lived longer than we did. By the late 50s, early 60s, we had the first baby incubators in the world. We created the first decent social housing system of large, first country-wide level. The majority of children who were born in 1946 at some point in their childhood lived in a council house. Right? That was an incredible innovation. Education. The number of changes we made to education, and in the 1960s, it was a circular. We decided that it was okay for the majority of children to be taught next to each other, not to segregate them. Other countries came to copy what we did. My favourite example is the Finns coming over to see how we organised our schools in the 1960s, and then decided to get rid of their grammar school system in Finland, and now are world leading. I'll run out of time if I go into why did it suddenly change and why has it gone up. Why we got inequality levels back at the 1930s. But the interesting, the hopeful thing is it's faltering. We are a very, very strange country, which is it's great if you're a geographer. It must be so boring to be doing geography in somewhere like Germany and go, we're a bit average, and Germany's the black line in the middle, right? And it must be kind of grueling if you are, whatever it is, Belgium and Finland and so on, where things are working actually quite well, although people do tend to moan everywhere. This graph is of the proportion of GDP spent on public goods over time, from the 1980s onwards. Whenever they tell you that we can't spend more, right, you've got to pretend that Europe doesn't exist, right? Or that all those European nations where they're spending an extra 1 or 2 health services worth of money on public goods are basket cases. And we're great. We're doing brilliantly. Try not to be too cynical, but if you do work in the state sector, you are working in the smallest, least funded, worst provisioned state sector on the continent. The graph does rise over time. Taxes are at their highest level for 70 years. Right? The big jumps are bailing out the banks and COVID. Right? You need governments at various times. But the reason for putting this up there is just to say, do not believe people. In particular, I'm thinking of somebody from Leeds called Rachel Reeves. Do not believe people when they tell you, oh, this is the most we can do. Right? Rachel didn't sadly study geography. Cynicism is a very bad habit of mine. But the kind of things that I work on are now commonly understood, which is great because you can move on and look at other things. This is Stephanie Flanders, who was the BBC economics correspondent, I think now works at Bloomberg, and John Byrne Murdoch, Financial Times. Right, we're in a bad way. The poorest fifth in this country are poorer than the poorest fifth in most of Eastern Europe. Right, I won't give you statistics and horror stories you may well know, but it's really important to remember we are very, very divided. So you can live in a nice detached house in Guiseley and be completely unaware of how people live in parts of the city just south of the river, right? Because we're so divided, various situations occur here, which if we really knew about them, we wouldn't tolerate. By we, I mean the top 10%, the best of people, the folk who can afford to buy a cup of coffee for £5, which is a minority. Last slide of this. There are different ways of doing things. Sarah is an artist who I do work with, and she does things like print the universal credit regulations onto silk to hang up in art galleries as a way of getting over just how strange it is what we do, what we inflict on people. Okay. The book that I last published was called 7 Children, and it was an attempt to do something different because most people don't like non-fiction books. You won't read them for pleasure. In fact, it's mainly men who buy non-fiction books. Women tend to read fiction. So I tried to write some fiction. It's really hard to do, but the fiction is based entirely on statistics. The 7 children are picked by taking all 14 million children that there were in 2018, sorting them by the money their families have, putting them into 7 groups of 2 million, and then picking a middle child. This is their income distribution. For those who are very good at numeracy, you'll notice a problem on the cover. My publishers are all arts graduates, and when I pointed out that there's the wrong number of bars, they said, "Oh, it looks good." And they're stubborn. So the last bar is Boris Johnson. And it goes up and up and up. His family. There were 100 very light grey bars. I'll pick the children out. The top 2 bars are cut off, by the way. The average income of people in the top 1% families is about 600,000. That's meaningless because the range is so huge. There is more inequality in the top 1% than in the other 99%. And people in the top 1% find it hard to cope often, which you may not believe. Some of them can't afford to buy their own wallpaper, which was coming back to our Boris. Well, when he went down to a prime minister's salary, he'd never been on as little. I won't. Anyway, I'll do that. That pie graph is showing the amount of money per week, per year that these 7 typical families have. Now, remember, I told you I picked the middle one out of every 2 million. So I'm excluding the million richest children. Their families take half of that entire pie again. Right? We could just take the money from the top 1, 2, 3, 4% and create absolute equality amongst everybody else. It's not that easy, but numerically it's possible. You'll have to look at the 7 Children book if you want to know about them. What shall I tell you? Anna is the poorest. Anna's dad doesn't live with them, which is quite likely. Anna's mum is a senior healthcare worker in an old age people's home. Right. Anna's mum and Anna are getting by on £118 a week, that's for food, everything apart from rent. Food, clothes, Anna's mum mobile phone, it's possible but minimal. Child number 7 is called Gemma. And Gemma's mum and dad run a corner shop. And they run it quite well. which means that after tax and they don't get benefits, and after paying the mortgage, they have an income of £25,000 each, 50,000 in total. That's the rich kid, right? That's the rich kid. If your family, your household has an income of more than £50,000 a year, you're above my 7 children. You're not typical of the UK. You may well be typical of the people you know and mix with and are around, but you're not typical of the UK. Part of the reason why it's so bad is that poverty is concentrated amongst families with children in this country. But it's shocking levels of inequality. More graphs. We are currently living through the second greatest cost of living crisis in recorded history in Britain. Now, we're lucky because we have a lot of recorded history. The first biggest cost of living crisis began, I think, in 1798 and lasted about 24 years. Right? This is the second biggest. This current cost of living crisis is far outweighs all of the last century and so on. We almost got out of it. We almost got out of it before inflation began during the pandemic. We almost got back to 2008. So if you're teaching children, they have never known a time in which what used to happen, that is, people's lives get better on average, happens on average. About 40% of children have no summer holiday. Increasing numbers of parents, when asked, say they don't need one. So a lot of these things are quite upsetting when you watch the changes. What happens when you have high and continuous inequality? You don't stay the same. That second graph is about the inequality and when it changed. This is my beef with New Labour over, didn't bring it down, didn't move it one iota, didn't go up. 1 million children were moved from just beneath the poverty line to just above it. So officially, yes, 1 million children went out of poverty, but by so little that their families may not have noticed. Positive things. That's the same graph for most of Europe. Inequality is falling in most places now, most of the time. Yes, globally, we have a few billionaires. Highly annoying. Weird, to be honest. You know, you think about the richest man in the world and his life. You think, how on earth did we allow that to happen? And at the very extremes, for the very poorest 500 million and the richest 50 men, that inequality is rising. But out of that, actually, things in most places are sorting themselves out. People are achieving things. This is a lovely graph. This is the United Nations estimate for all the countries that they measure child poverty in of the most recent change in the 7-year period till about 2 or 3 years ago. Falling. Look at all those purple lines. Huge falls in child poverty. Right? Incredible achievements. We never talk about good news. We never talk about when good governments get in. We always talk about the rise of the far right. We don't talk about when it falls. Right? We tend not to be good at that. If you've got good eyesight, you'll see the bad news at the top of the graph. Right? It's like some child in the class has to be worst, right? But it is sad. And the countries just beneath us that have had rises have some of the lowest rates. You know, France and Switzerland and Norway, they had low rates of child poverty and they've had a small increase. We had a high rate and we've had a big increase, which is why you should do something about it. If you want to know what to do, it's very easy. I'm arrogant, but there's a country in Europe which has decided it wants to get rid of child poverty. It gives every family with children who claim benefits now, I think it's almost £30 a week, untapered on top. For a family of 3, that's £4,000 a year. No child, if it's well administered, needs to go hungry or cold. Anybody know where this country is? No? I haven't got time, so we won't do my normal guessing game. People normally kind of guess Norway, Finland, and so on. It's a really interesting, weird country that we probably can't copy because it's so different to us. It's called Scotland. Scotland has a child poverty payment. introduced first of all as £10 a week for children under 6 during the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. It's now risen. Every year, those poverty statistics are released by the UK government. Scotland is the only part of the UK which areas have now have falling child poverty in it. Scotland has the lowest rate of child poverty of all of Britain. There is less child poverty in Scotland than in the South East or Surrey. Okay. Crises and worldwide. Forget about Britain for the moment. Because we are worriers. When we worry really well, we sort things out. We don't put up with the situations that we're in. This is what's happening in Scotland. They're not willing to put up. There's a quiet deal between Labour in Scotland and the SNP not to this debate whether they should have the child payments. They're going to do it. They've been doing it for years. Crises is the latest thing I've been looking at. Kind of less depressing than looking at Britain worldwide. The graph is showing you how often the word is used in English language over time. We've been having a lot since the 1960s. I kind of feel it's partly we have the luxury now to worry about things more. If you go back before 1900, then certainly Europe was a place full of wars, pandemics, pestilence, endless crises. Right? You actually have to have stability. You have to have things getting better to actually worry about crises. That graph ends just before 2019. So you know it's going to zoom up because a little thing happened at the end of 2019. The map is of everybody known to have died in wars since 1989. When I look at it, I kind of looks a, I don't know, controversial. I worry too much. I have to worry too much about words. It looks a bit like a crusade, right? Apart from Rwanda, it's, you know, the people who are being killed, they're not being killed by weapons made in these countries mostly. So what are the biggest crises in the world? Right? You can ask people. You can ask people, what is it you worry about? There's various ways of asking, and it alters. What you get is a list like this. This is the global list. It varies by countries. But in the UK, inflation, cost of living, inequality and poverty, issue number 1. Right? Once you put them together, absolutely. How am I going to get by? Is most people's concerns worldwide and in places like the UK. The second is, am I going to be useful? Am I needed? Am I going to be unemployed? Right, very basic concerns. Right. These are people's concerns on average. Yours will be different. Your list will be different. Hopefully you don't spend your whole day worrying about what are my biggest concerns. You know, it's not a healthy way to be. War, crime, safety, number 3. It's chapter 4, number 3. Then things like health services. The biggest concern to the population in China is health services. Maybe having to pay a bribe to get it. Will it be enough? It's an aging country. But also, if you're in China, many other things are fairly well sorted out. Right? So we always have a biggest worry. And you know that your living conditions are so much better than your parents and grandparents that you're unlikely to complain about other things. So it varies. And it's not until we get to number 6, and if you've got very good eyesight, you can see when they asked them individually, I think it was number 8, that climate change features as a top concern for people. And the concern about climate change is dropping now over time. Not amongst affluent young people in Europe, but amongst the population of the world as a whole. Partly because it's not immediate, partly because people have been told so much. There are huge variations. Here's something that we're very good at, right? The UK is the best country in the world at teaching about climate change and having a unified voice about climate change. So we have the lowest proportion of people in the world who think it's a hoax. And that is a quiet political agreement amongst political parties not to fight on that one. And our media deciding not to do a balanced debate, let's put the denier on, you know that. But we are unusual on that. I've got one more slide, so you need to think of questions. I know it's been all over the place, but I'm interested in different topics. All these things are linked. Those weird graphs are showing you just how much the rich emit. Most people who fly on Ryanair and EasyJet, social class A, B, and occasionally C1. Right? You need surveys. You might make assumptions about people. But Leeds Bradford Airport, and who's going to holidays? Right? People who are poorer don't fly, can't fly. Right? It's the well-off. And 1% of us in the UK use up 25% of all flights. A bit more equality, and you get less pollution, less carbon pollution. I'm going to put my last slide up, but I won't go through it. I'm putting it up partly because we are so near to Bradford at the moment. And this is the banner of the East Bradford Socialist Sunday School, produced in early 1914. You may not know there was a Socialist Sunday School movement. I don't think there are any Socialist Sunday Schools anymore. But there's their 10 commandments of it. These were the kind of things going on in Britain a century ago. Differences about how we could think or talk. The sad thing about the banner is it's got little poppies on it, right? And it's all about hope and so on. And it was produced just before the First World War began. And nobody thought that war was going to last for any length of time, or was aware of what the repercussions of fighting a war for that long, spending that much money would actually have on a country. Because it was after the First World War that inequalities began to fall. And then they fell for 50 years, and we changed utterly. The most common job for women used to be working in service. By the 1960s or 70s, when the judge asked at the Lady Chatterley's trial to the jury, is this a book do you like your wife or servants to read? They just laughed. Okay? Huge transformation in the country. We are at a peak of inequality again. We are the most unequal country in Europe. Odds on, it's falling. It has begun to fall already. We're seeing almost all pay agreements with unions are progressive. Right? The lower you're paid, the higher the union is demanding you get a rise, because otherwise you're going to go hungry. And if you're high paid, they don't try and get your pay up as much. Every trade union agreement since 2019 has been like that. I can give you good news. Things may be beginning to change, but I think you need to see this country as weird, an outlier at a weird time. And then I don't know how you describe it or talk about these issues with children, but we certainly shouldn't pretend that this is normal, because to be a child in England today is not a normal thing to be in the rich world. Thank you very much, and please ask me some questions.
Thank you very much, Danny. You've given us a huge amount to consider, both globally and locally. I have no doubt there'll be some questions. I'm going to pass the microphone back to the board by Claire, if anybody is asking anything like that. Perhaps if I can just kick us off. You mentioned a number of your books in your talk to us today, and you described them as being a little bit lonely. But for anybody who is looking to embrace a slightly known book and perhaps delve a little bit deeper into some of the information that you've shared, where would you recommend to start?
Where to start on? I wouldn't necessarily start with what I do. What's the very nice Swedish man who does Gapminder? You remember him? No. He was a doctor, and he produced a book called Factfulness. Anybody nodding? Yeah. So just Google nice Swedish man factfulness inequality. I've forgotten his name, as you can tell. Oh, Hans Rosling. Yep, Hans Rosling, thank you. Start with Hans Rosling. It's also a bit more politically neutral than me. And he's not talking about Britain, he's talking about the world. So it's easier. And you can show there's lots of videos of him running around on stage, moving boxes around, trying to explain what's going on in the world. So I'd start with Hans Rosling. Anybody brave enough?
Just like to know if there's sort of any hope.
Yeah.
Interest rates aren't coming down though. So have we got any graphs of hope?
Graphs of hope. I should do some. My youngest child is, he checked this book on the next crisis, which gets published next month, and he said truthful but hopeful. So I think there's lots and lots of ways in which you can look for hope. One is there's these really simple things, like the fact that no dictator is managing to force women to have more children. They've been trying. They've been trying in Turkey. Their incentives and money is not working. Everywhere, almost everywhere, apart from us in the USA, child health is still improving. Education access is still improving almost everywhere in the world. I don't know. I think the Trump phenomenon in the States is interesting because it kind of calls their bluff. There's this country which we've had this special relationship with ever since the Second World War that we've kind of copied. So we've been taking our social policies from the United States. And suddenly, our best friend turns out to be a bit of a stupid bully. So what are we going to do? Are we going to carry on going, oh, we need to have a closer relationship with the United States and do what they want? Or are we going to actually think, can we think on our own feet? What is the rest of the world thinking about the United States right now? Obviously, you don't publicly say, Donald, right? You quietly talk to each other and work out, can I buy from you what I need and can you buy from me? And can we just circumvent this bully, which has 6 or 7 enormous battle fleets and thinks it can go around the world getting its own way? So I personally think it's hopeful. It's not subtle. What's going on. I think people are waking up to it. I would be much more worried if the US leadership was sleek, charismatic, right? It would be scary, kind of a kind of trust in us, let's get rid of elections, you want to be led by your betters and by the clever people. The fact it's Elon and Donald, hopefully we'll look back at history and say that was the moment when most people in the world didn't accept that we're led by our betters anymore, right? And it may sound a bit trite, but I think without that having happened, we may have taken longer to work out that we're all able, we could think for ourselves, and it is very, very dangerous to allow power to concentrate and money to concentrate in the hands of a few people. I can give you take illness or pandemics. Right, you're often told to worry about pandemics, but in fact the frequency of pandemics has been going down over time. So COVID 2019 was a shock. The last big flu pandemic was a little one in 1977, 1968, 69. Before then, 1957. 1918 was a big one, right? But the actual frequency is going down of these things. So the things we tend to worry about, and although I showed you the map of wars, We've had a small rise in the last 10, 15 years in wars, but in general, we are, as a species, more and more angry about people being killed and don't see it as justifiable. We have rising numbers of women in positions of power around the world. It's even possible that in Norway, for younger women, there is parity of power and esteem and money. That hasn't happened for millennia. Right? There are incredible new situations occurring. 100 years ago, if we were having a meeting like this, you'd all be men. And you'd all be wearing things to show your rank in the social order. Okay? It's changing. I'm generally hopeful. I worry about things like our nuclear missiles, but that's because I'm a man of a certain age and grew up in the 1980s. But, we've still got them.
Will the blacksmith please report to the Windsor Gallery?
Will do. So the minute you mention nuclear missiles in an armoury, you're in trouble. I would be hopeful, but not complacent. We can feed everybody quite easily in the world. And if we ate less meat, which would be good for us, it gets even easier. Yeah. If it turned out that eating meat was good for you, that would be bad news, because it produces so much pollution. But it isn't. I ought to collect together hopeful things. But yeah, there are lots and lots of hopeful things. I think we've got about 5 minutes if you've got more questions. Mm-hmm.
I'm loud, I'll be okay.
Go on.
I'm really interested in your book about the 7 children, and I've got a particular focus around attendance. What did you learn about the attitudes of the kind of more disadvantaged children to school and their families from writing that book? I don't want any spoilers, but I'm going to go read it.
No. I cheated a bit in the book in that I only. That blacksmith's in trouble, isn't he? I took the children from age 0 to just when they went to school, partly because it's really hard to do dialogue and they don't say very much. It's their parents. School refusers. I mean, we are world leading for school refusers and for truancy and exclusion and suspending children. As far as we can see, there's a huge project. It costs many millions at my university. It's quite hard to get the statistics, but we're pretty sure that we expel and suspend the highest number of children in Europe because we have this idea that schools competing against each other would be a good idea, right? And it's good that we tested it. It's a crap idea. But we've done numerous things for the rest of the world. The official number of children in Scotland excluded a year is about 5 or 6. I know there's actually more. There might be 90. Right? It's different attitude to education, different words used. I do like the fact that Scotland is in the UK. I'm not having to keep on pointing to Finland or somewhere else. But it's bad. It got particularly bad in the pandemic. We almost certainly made a mistake. It's still controversial, but Denmark, I think they had the children back in the primary schools within about 6 or 7 weeks at the beginning of wave 1 and kept them there. We can look across Europe and see what policies worked and what didn't, who suffered, how ill teachers got or how they didn't. What we did is we rolled out the Centre for Disease Control plan for a 1918 flu. Flu goes up in 5 weeks, it goes down in 5 weeks. It's really sharp. And you're overwhelmed. So it makes sense to do a lockdown. And we didn't know with COVID what kind of a disease it was. We didn't know the death rate, give or take a 10-fold difference at the beginning. We had a couple of cruise liners on which everybody had got it, and we had some deaths. And when we had those villages in Italy. So it made sense. But after those first few weeks of uncertainty, it became clearer what the risks were. And many, many parts of Europe kept all the primary school children back in school and lots of secondary school children, and we didn't. And that particularly has led to a legacy now of going to school being seen as optional. If you can, despite the fact, of course, you could be imprisoned, almost always the mother, really unfairly, imprisoned if your children don't go to school. It's a mess. We need to get out of it, but we also want schools that children want to go to. So one study I was involved with looked, there's a study called Children in the 90s, which is all the children born around about 1992, I think, in Avon, in Bristol. And they've got all their genes, they've got all the placentas kept in freezers. Right? They've got everything on these children, and they followed them up. It's the kind of study that tells you it's okay for a child to eat a bit of dirt in the garden. They're more likely not to get ill, and peanut allergies, all this stuff, medical. But we were looking at what affected how well children did at age 16. And a huge predictor was not liking school at age 8. Right? And in every school in Bristol, around 1 in 10 children really didn't like their school. And that's interesting because Bristol's a very divided city. It has 20% go private. There isn't a good school, as far as children are concerned, or a bad school. 1 in 10 children didn't like their school. And slightly trite, but the answer is let them move school. If you've got a child who really hates school and you're in a city and you can move, moving to another school, different friendship group, maybe fitting in, might be the thing that helps you. But school is a kind of form of a prison. And, it's enforced and you have to think in a certain way, and you have to be quiet, and you have to do the 9-point question for your GCSE and so on. And we're not running them particularly well if you compare schools internationally. When teachers go to Finland, they are shocked by what they see as chaos in the classrooms, right? And children don't wear shoes, which helps because you're going to get kicked. But they're shocked. The blacksmith. Brilliant. Okay. I'm overemphasizing how good Finland is, but and of course it's not all chaotic. But teachers are given autonomy and they're respected. It's a country in which it's very easy to live as well because things are much more equal. Housing costs are lower. And the result is that when it comes to ability in mathematics and problem solving and languages, whether you speak 5 or 6 or 7, young adults in Finland are just incredibly well educated and employable. For doing, if you want to hire somebody who's multilingual and can actually program computers and think about other things. Whereas what we are producing are people who've got 7s or 8s and 9s in GCSE and know what to do to get an A or an A star at A level, and are absolutely like a rabbit in the headlights if you ask them to use their imagination. Right? It's very, very sad. There's maybe one at the back.
Thanks, Danny. Kieran Gill, I run the difference.
Uh-huh.
I was just really struck by that whole sort of section of your talk just now, and I think you're absolutely right where you finished. We need to think about what drives all children to feel fulfilled and enjoy their lives at school and feel belonging. But I felt really worried when you said, what do we do about those 1 in 10? They should move school. Because actually, we've got a situation at the moment in England where we've got sort of magnet schools, might be more inclusive. They're the ones that get more than their fair share of young people from the most deprived postcodes or those children known to have special needs. We actually need every school to be able to evolve beyond the sort of what you just sort of conjured up in that image. I don't think all schools are prisons. I've got pretty loads of schools that aren't prisons. But if any children are feeling like they don't belong at school, for those that we know about, there's a whole other cohort we don't know about. And I'd just like to push back kindly to say, I don't think we should move them.
No.
I think they should stay where they are, and we should lean into that challenge.
No, you can't have them all moving. It's just that people often don't think, my child is really hating this, and don't realise that when they do move, sometimes that's the thing that sorts it. But if you take, I'm from Oxford, so a little town with 6 state secondary schools. and a third of children going private in a huge number of private schools, incredibly inefficient. But we have 6 secondaries. Now, imagine, and we're managing to get the cars out slowly of Oxford so it's safe to go around. You can cycle from one end of the city in about 20 minutes. Now, imagine if you could move the teachers around between those sites so that you didn't have all the teachers aged over 40 at the posh comprehensive and all the teachers below 25 at the bottom one. Imagine if you could move the teachers around. Imagine if you could move the pupils around so one of those sites had the best science equipment and they could go and do chemistry there if they wanted to, right? And then imagine you can do this and your schools are actually properly working together, not token pretending to work together because somebody's told them they're supposed to do that, right? But actually the schools of your city actually working together so there isn't this divide between them. In the city of Oxford, I think we have the greatest educational divide in Europe amongst what happens to the outcome of our children. And absolutely tragedy, they don't see each other. They don't mix. The ones behind the walls of the private schools are paid. The parents are paying so they don't meet the other children. We'll look back at this and go, can you believe you did this? You know, can you actually believe that we had a system? There are house price differences in my city of £100,000 between each catchment area. You know, it's utterly ridiculous. And the level of paranoia, because it's a city full of academics, and academics can never understand why their children aren't as weird as they were. But the level of paranoia when it comes to, are they going to get into that primary school? Can I get a house in that area? Will the grandparents give the money I need so they can go to that private school? It's all transfixing and it's bad. So I'll end with this. At High Table, at the University of Oxford, you can talk about anything when you get a bit drunk. You can talk about politics. You can talk about sex if you're slightly daring. You might even mention, although it's slightly bad taste, newspaper story yesterday, turns out there was a skull that people were drinking from in Worcester College as recently as 2015. So the question is, well, which of our colleagues was around in 2015 and drank from the skull, okay? Bad taste. There's only one subject you cannot talk about at High Table at my university. It's completely taboo. And that subject is, where do your children go to school? Because unless the other person's children go to exactly the same school as your children, you are either sacrificing their future for your political ideals, or you're a snob. And so the easy thing to do is not mention education. And I'm working in an education, right, facility, but the worry is so high that it's the one thing we do not talk about is where are our children going to school in the city of Oxford? Because we are choosing to be separate from each other. And I think it's very, very sad. It doesn't produce good education for anybody, including the ones at the supposed very top, is usually wasteful. One of our private schools has a 9-hole golf course within the city. We have the most expensive housing in Europe. You know, why are we teaching 10, 11 and 12-year-old boys to play golf at school? You know, what on earth is that about? So, but thank you. Thank you very much for your question.